Welcome, friends. Welcome to our series, All Parts Welcome. All of our parts are welcome. This is a special conversation series with the founder of Internal Family Systems, Dick Schwartz. Dick, welcome. All parts welcome. Yeah. And we're here with very special guest, Jonathan Van Ness, big-hearted, non-binary truth teller and comedian. Emmy-nominated television personality, New York Times bestselling author, podcaster, hairstylist, and founder of JVN. Jonathan, all parts welcome.
Thank you for having me. I love the title of your podcast, and your curls are gorgeous.
Oh my God. Well, you've just made my life.
So pretty.
Made my life. Thank you.
I mean, so pretty. So good.
In Over the Top, your memoir, the very first chapter is called All the Parts. And I wonder if we can start our conversation, share a little bit how you came to IFS, how you relate to the model.
Sure. Well, it was really my therapist, Marty, is the one who introduced me to IFS. And it was such a, I mean, I've been in and out of therapy since I was like 5. So I definitely didn't have any like, or, not much like stigma around, like shame around like, the idea of therapy. But of all of the modalities that I had tried or had been around, nothing clicked for me the way that like the theory of parts did, and does. And so I was just like, oh my God, that really, I see that so clearly in my life. And so that was when I was maybe 22, but then, my brain, I'm so sorry, you guys. I just was learning about sleep for the last 2 hours in an episode of my podcast, Getting Curious. So I've just been like learning all about these like regions of the brain. So I have to like shake my brain out of that. Building block wise, I do think that like Eckhart Tolle and like A New Earth and The Power of Now, like those books kind of introduced me into the idea of like, the centered self, or like, or the observer of the ego, So I think when I read A New Earth, that was like the first time, or maybe it was either The Power of Now or A New Earth. I can't remember which one because I read both, but that's where I was kind of like, ego, like I don't have an ego, like what is that? And then I was like, oh, that's like the voice in our head. It doesn't mean you have like a big, even though I was like, I guess some of the voice in my head does have a big ego, but I didn't like someone telling me that I had one. But I think that idea, and that idea of like, oh, you're the person in the movie theater watching the movie screen that is your thoughts. Like that was an analogy that I'd heard in yoga. And then that also was like kind of referred to in A New Earth, or whichever one of those two books, big fan of Eckhart. But I think that, and then coming into understanding parts, like though that kind of felt like it supported it, I was like, oh, your centered self is like that observer. That makes sense. And like, that's how we're born, is that. And then as we incur trauma, because like your brain is like it's not meant to make the cortisol, like it's meant for like love and acceptance. But then, we experience trauma, rejection, whatever, and then your brain makes the cortisol, like it starts, and that's how you create the parts that, do know how to deal with that trauma and do know how to deal with that rejection. And that just made so much sense to me. And I saw all of the ways, like in terms of my personal story, the way that manifested itself, or just the way that like the system of parts, I was like, I see that in my life so clearly. And so I think that kind of gave me a new language in terms, to answer your question, the reason that it was so powerful and useful is that it gave me a new language with like friends, my family, like people in my life, where I could like quickly explain, because I really looked at like my drug addiction through a parts lens. I was really like, oh, like there's like, I called him Crystal Meth Boy. Like that was like a different part. You're like the one that couldn't stop doing meth. And that really feels vulnerable for me to talk about. And even as I say that, I feel a part come up that's kind of like, oh, like it just feels weird when I talk about it. So you'd think I would feel more comfortable talking about some of these things for as much as I've talked about it. But that was why it was useful, because I could, quickly explain something to a loved one in my life and then speak. I'm like, oh, I have a part up right now. Or I could explain kind of my story through that lens. And that seemed to make people understand quicker and easier. And I think also, like, when I've explained it to people, I see the light bulbs kind of go off in their eyes too. Like, they're like, oh, like they see it in themselves as well. It just feels like such a useful modality for like explaining like our life experience.
And Dick, I wonder if you can help bring all of our listeners aboard here.
Yeah, that was a
When Jonathan's talking about something like the self and this observer, the one who's aware of all of our different parts, how you understand that within IFS, and help unpack something like addiction within the IFS model and how we can understand that.
Sure. And again, Jonathan, I think I told you this before, but I have so much more credibility once with my kids, once they heard that you were into IFS. That's all it took.
I'm glad I could help.
So huge fans of yours. So, yeah, so what you were saying as the observer in the theater, as you're observing your thoughts and emotions, aka Eckhart Tolle, from my point of view, you're watching these parts operate and you're getting a little separation from them. And as you do that, it turns out that this you in there who is there when they do separate has all these wonderful leadership qualities. In addition to being an observer and a calm observer, that self, what I call with a capital S, can actually reach out to these parts and begin interacting with them in a healing way. And that's a lot of what we do with IFS. And so relative to addiction, I know from reading how bad your childhood was, and in lots of different ways, and all of those kinds of traumas inject our parts with extreme beliefs and emotions that we call burdens, and freeze them in time, so they kind of live as if you're still in that kind of danger. And then those kinds of parts that carry the worthlessness or the terror or the pain of those experiences, we don't want anything to do with, because they can pull us into those scenes and make us feel all of that. So those are what I call exiles. And when you had a childhood like yours, you have a lot of exiles. And when you have a lot of exiles and you're trying your best to live a life without having to feel all that, you need help from these other parts that get forced into these extreme roles to try and deal with all that pain and shame and terror. So what did you call him? The meth boy?
Well, I really abbreviate him and I call him CMB so that I don't have to say crystal meth boy in therapy so much. So really we abbreviate him to CMB, but yes.
CMB, what I call a firefighter, whose job it is to get you higher than those flames of exiled emotion. And
But Dick, I have to tell you something really quick, because I feel like I have this weird smirk as you're answering. And you guys, I just have to tell you, because if you're using the video, the only reason that I have this weird smirk is because I literally noticed myself like wanting to shout out the answers, like, exiles, you're talking about exiles. And then I was like, firefighters, now this is going to be firefighters. And I was like literally laughing at my internal rhetorical fireworks that were like wanting to like be like, oh, I know this one, which is why I had that weird smirk, not because what you're talking about is actually really serious. I was more laughing at my rhetorical fireworks, you guys. I'm used to podcasts like not using the video, so you could just like let your face do whatever you want. But when it's like a different medium.
You can definitely let your face do whatever it wants to do.
I'm like, don't smirk at this. It's like serious. But then I just was like laughing at myself because I was like trying to be like the best little student, which is a different part. That's one of my managers, which you're going to get into next.
Yes, that is exactly where I'm going next. So when you have a firefighter that's trying to help you out that way, and it's particularly if it's doing something that our culture frowns on, you're going to have these critics that are going to attack you for the firefighter activity, and that'll go straight to the heart of the exile, who now feels more worthless, that you can't control yourself. And all of that increased shame increases the need for the firefighter activity. So most people with addictions are caught in that triangular kind of spiral. And somehow you had a fondness for this. What were the initials again?
CMB.
CMV boy. Yeah, and I think that probably helped you. I don't know. I'd love to hear more about.
Well, I didn't at first, but at first I really hated that part and was like really mad at it all the time and like was just like really frustrated, because it was like messing me up. Then Marty was really the one who was able to and really taught me that like I don't need to be so like I need to make friends with CMB because he's like trying to protect me. He just like learned some stuff when I was like younger and that's like now out of whack. And it was also just like triggered because like my stepdad had died and he was so important to me and there was just like, other things that happened that like really triggered that firefighter. And so once I learned to like not be so scared of CMB, because I think I was really avoidant, like for years, like there were certain streets I wouldn't drive down because I was afraid it would like trigger, because like the intrusive thoughts and like flashbacks and like with the meth use were really intense. Like I could be doing someone's hair and just like all of a sudden like be in a room, like in my mind, like where a relapse happened. And I just was really nervous about like a disassociation event and like me just like losing, like just being off to the races. But interestingly, like through a lot of that work with Marty, like I was able to like, that just wasn't the case anymore. Like those streets didn't trigger me in the same way. And I can go to LA anytime now and like be on any street in any place. And it's not, it just doesn't, like I have been able to process that trauma, which has been really amazing. But all of that happened from like, really doing that work of like making friends with that part, which took, at least in my case, like a long time. Like, it took me like a year or 4. But also like I was running a business and I was in my 20s. And I think if I had been like more focused on it, maybe it could have gone faster, but we all heal like in our own time and in like our own way. So it was worth it.
That's great. And usually even making friends with that part can help, but usually it can't stand down so much until the exiles that trigger it have been healed. So with her, you must have done some of that exile work as well. Does that sound right?
Yeah, we did a lot. But it's interesting because like that, I think at least in like my work and my exploration, like I refer to that and over the top as like, I wish that you could like process your trauma and like put it in a really neatly wrapped box and like put it on a shelf and never deal with it again. And I think like logically, and this is always my problem in therapy, it's like logically I've done all that work. I don't know if like I've necessarily like processed all of it. Like I still can really feel a part that does have shame around my exiles and around like the inner child parts. And it's really been interesting for me, like becoming, it still feels even weird saying it after like 6 years, but becoming famous and a celebrity, like it is just like, I don't want to say it like set me back, but I do think that it did in certain ways. Like I think I was like maybe more fully processed before, like because when you fail in public or when you get criticized like so publicly or like shamed so publicly, and even now I feel myself like wanting to like, it's just it's a lot harder to, and maybe it gets like easier at some point, but I do feel like it's made it harder.
I understand that. Yeah. I have some of the same. So, yeah.
You're getting more famous these days, Dick. Is it bringing up stuff for you?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very mixed bag for me in a lot of similar ways, because the more public you become, the more of a target you become as well. And to be called out publicly is not fun. And it brings up a lot of these exiles. Yeah.
Jonathan, I
Yeah.
wanted to just say something, when you said it took me 1 year, 2 year, 3 years to, make friends and not be so judgmental of Crystal Meth Boy. And that was a long time. I thought that doesn't sound like a long time to me. That
It
sounds
felt
like,
like it when you're like, you know, relapsing and like, you know, exposing yourself to like so much danger and like just like traumatizing yourself so much. So it felt long to be, yeah, it was pretty painful. It felt really long.
But
I mean,
what would
I
you,
guess for
what
some
would you,
people that like goes much longer, but it
sure,
was,
for sure. That's what I was thinking of, is
yeah.
people who suffer for quite a
It's like
long
so
time.
much
But what,
compassion for them because fuck, it's just so hard.